The first time I saw her, the land was holding its breath under a sky the color of hammered copper. The sun bore down on my wheat field, each stalk bowing low as if in surrender to the drought. She came weaving through the brittle rows, her steps uneven, her body swaying like someone caught between standing and falling. From the distance I could see her dress was torn, her hair hanging in heavy strands, her face turned toward me as though I were the last thing she'd ever see. She made it halfway across the field before her knees gave out, and I dropped my hoe without thinking. By the time I reached her, her lips were too dry for words. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to make a choice that could change the course of your life. I'm Daniel Reed. Born in 1839 to a family that measured a man by the steadiness of his word and the calluses on his hands. My father worked the soil outside Council Bluffs, and my mother kept a home where the Sabbath meant clean clothes, a hot meal, and the good book read aloud by lamplight. We didn't have much, but we shared what we had, whether with kin or a stranger passing through. That's how I was raised to greet a knock at the door with bread and coffee before asking a name. In my younger years, I worked where I could, a season on a cattle drive, a winter hauling freight for the Army summers in the wheat fields. I learned how to coax crops from stubborn ground, how to read weather signs, and how quickly fortunes could turn out here. When I married Margaret, we took a claim of our own in the Nebraska territory, 160 acres of open prairie. We worked it together, her laughter carrying across the fields as we built something worth passing down. 3 winters ago, fever took her before I could fetch the doctor from town. After that, the house was too quiet, and the looks from neighbors, all pity and good intentions, felt heavier than solitude. So I kept to myself, poured my strength into the land, and let the seasons turn without much notice. By this summer, the drought had been grinding on for weeks, the kind of heat that split the earth into jagged patterns and left the well dropping lower by the day. The railroad men were moving closer, buying up plots from farmers too worn down to fight. Folks in town talked about progress, about selling, while the prices were good. But I'd seen enough deals to know they rarely favored men like me. Out here, I could still choose my own hours, tend my own soil, and keep my distance from those who'd trade loyalty for a quick dollar. That morning had been like any other: sweat in my eyes, grit under my nails, the sound of dry wind in my ears, until I saw her. There was no reason for anyone to be crossing my land, not in that heat, not dressed like that, and certainly not alone. By the time I carried her into my cabin, her skin was hot as a stove lid, her heartbeat faint against my arm. I set her on my bed, dipped a cup into the cool water from my well, and eased it to her lips. She drank in small swallows, eyes fluttering open for a moment before closing again. I didn't know then who she was or what road had brought her to my field, only that she wouldn't last long without help. I meant to keep her alive through the day, maybe the night, and send her on her way once she was strong enough. But as I looked at the cracked earth outside and the distant shimmer of heat over the plains, I realized there might be more to this than one act of charity. And just before sundown, as the shadows stretched long across the porch, I caught the faintest sound of horses on the wind, too many to be passing through by chance. Ayana's breathing was still shallow by the time the heat began to fade from the day. I kept her shaded and gave her water in small sips, careful not to push too much on a body worn thin by thirst. Her skin felt hot beneath my hand, her pulse weak but steadying. I'd seen men pulled from battlefields with less fight left in them. Yet there was something in the way she clung to the cup that told me she wasn't ready to let go. By nightfall, I had a small fire going in the hearth, its light softening the edges of the cabin's single room. I eased her onto my bed, placing a folded quilt beneath her head. She stirred once or twice, murmuring in a language I didn't know, words faint as the wind in the rafters. I sat nearby, listening for any change in her breathing, and each time her chest rose, I felt the smallest knot of worry loosen. Dawn crept in pale and quiet. I had dozed in my chair when I heard her shift. Her eyes were open now, clearer than before, the gold brown in them catching the light. "You saved me," she said, her voice raspy but sure. I told her my name and she gave me hers, Ayana. She was Omaha, the granddaughter of a woman she called strong and wise, now gone to the heat and the dust. She spoke of it with the same steady tone she used to tell me she'd been walking for 2 days without water after burying her grandmother by hand. She asked about the place where she lay, and I told her it was mine, a claim set far from town, where the land stretched out so wide a man could see weather coming half a day ahead. I admitted I lived here alone since my wife passed 3 years before. She nodded slowly, as if the kind of loss I carried was one she could understand without needing me to say more. In the days that followed, her strength returned bit by bit. She moved lightly about the cabin, helping where she could, washing dishes, sweeping the floor, even tending the patch of vegetables I had fought to keep alive in the drought. She spoke of her journey north to join her father's people, a gathering of related bands where she and her grandmother had been expected weeks ago. Her voice faltered when she explained how they lost their way in the dry country, how the old woman gave her the last swallow of water. By the second week, the heat had only worsened. The well ran lower than I'd ever seen, and the air shimmered above the fields like waves off a forge. Still, her presence softened the edges of the days. We'd sit on the porch in the evenings, the boards creaking under our chairs, trading stories of the worlds we came from. She spoke of wide rivers and tall grass, of dances held under moonlight. I told her of my early years trailing cattle, of how Margaret could coax green shoots from soil most men would have walked away from. One evening, lightning flickered far off on the horizon, too distant to bring rain. She asked why I had chosen a life so far from other people. I told her about the months after Margaret's passing, when neighbors tried to offer comfort I couldn't bear to take. Solitude felt easier than their eyes on me. She didn't press, only nodded her gaze on the faint glow where the sun had gone down. The morning it happened was no different from any other sky white with heat, the land holding the smell of dry earth. I was working near the well, hammer in hand, when a low sound reached me, a deep rolling that didn't break like thunder. I stopped, head tilted, the rhythm too steady to be anything but hooves. Many of them. I climbed onto the roof for a better look. The prairie beyond the wheat was moving, a dark line thickening against the glare. As it drew nearer, the shapes became clear. Riders, hundreds of them, stretched wide across the grass. Horses ran hard, but disciplined their riders, upright spears and rifles catching the sun. Ayana stepped into the yard, her eyes fixed on the advancing line. Relief touched her face, but so did something harder. "They've found me," she said quietly. When I asked who, she told me it was her father's warriors and others. I followed her gaze and saw banners I didn't recognize, the colors shifting in the wind. She explained that when she and her grandmother failed to arrive, search parties would have gone out. Finding the grave, they would have known something had happened. This was no small rescue party. It was a gathering of allied bands, a show of strength to anyone who might think to harm a chief's daughter. The sound of hooves grew until it filled the air, a rolling thunder that seemed to make the ground itself tremble. They crested the last rise, the formation opening, until it spanned the land before my home. At their center rode a man with long hair, streaked gray braids, bound with care, his bearing that of someone who'd carried the weight of his people through hard years. Ayana stood still beside me as the riders slowed. The leader raised his hand, and the mass of horsemen stilled at once. The only sounds left were the breath of the animals and the dry whisper of grass in the wind. I knew without being told that this was her father, Chief Ironcloud. And as he urged his horse forward, closing the distance between us, the air seemed to hold tight around that moment. He called out to her in words I couldn't follow, his voice rich with something that reached across the space between them. She stepped forward, answering in kind, What passed between them in their own tongue was layered with the weight of both grief and relief. My name was spoken more than once, though I could only guess at the shape of the story she told. When he turned his eyes to me, they were sharp, but not unkind. The space between us seemed suddenly smaller, the air thick with the measure he was taking of me. And though I didn't yet know what would come next, the quiet that followed felt like the moment before a card is turned, when everything might change depending on what's shown. Chief Ironcloud brought his horse to a halt a short distance from where I stood. The animal's breath steamed faintly in the heat, and the long shadow of the chief's figure reached toward me over the brittle grass. His gaze swept over the cabin, the yard, and the fields beyond before settling on me. For a moment, the riders behind him were silent, their horses shifting in place, leather tack creaking with the movement. Ayanna stepped closer to him, speaking in their language. The words moved quickly between them, her voice rising and falling with emotion. I could feel more than understand. My name came into the exchange more than once. Ironcloud's eyes returned to me as the conversation slowed. "You are the man who found my daughter," he said in measured English, his voice clear and deliberate. I told him I was, and he repeated what she had told him, that I had carried her from the field, given her water, and watched over her without asking anything in return. His face did not change much as he spoke, but there was a weight in his tone that made it plain this was no casual meeting. Why, he asked simply. The question hung between us, steady as his gaze. I told him the truth, that when someone's life is in danger and you can help, there isn't much else worth considering. He gave a slow nod, glancing briefly toward Ayanna, before looking past me to the fields. Her grandmother died on this journey, he said. She was loved. You have honored that love by giving my daughter another chance to live. His words carried a formal weight now, each one placed carefully. He spoke of the way their people saw such acts, of the bonds they believed were formed when a life was saved. As he spoke, the riders behind him sat as still as fence posts, the air thick with the heat and the smell of horse. Ironcloud paused, then said something I had not expected. A tie has been made between you and her, he told me, and between you and us. It should be honored openly. He let that rest in the air before adding, in our way, such a bond is sealed through family. The meaning took shape quickly enough. He was speaking of marriage. I looked to Ayanna. She met my eyes without turning away, her face calm but serious. The chief spoke to her again in their tongue, and she answered him without hesitation. He turned back to me, translating her words. She says you are a man of honor. She would accept such a bond, if you will. The afternoon light was lowering the horizon, already showing a faint build of darker clouds. I thought of the weeks she had been here, of the quiet steadiness she carried, and of the truth that her presence had changed the shape of my days. When I gave my answer, it was plain and without flourish. Yes, I will honor it. Ironcloud lifted a hand, and the formation shifted slightly, creating space in front of the cabin. The movement was practiced almost ceremonial. Word passed quickly among the riders, and within minutes a circle formed. Ayanna stepped to my side, her hair lifting slightly in the dry wind. The ceremony was simple but deliberate, joining the ways of both our people. There were words in English, and in their language, hands joined and blessed, and small signs of respect exchanged between the elders and me. Ayanna wore a ring of wildflowers she had gathered from the garden out back earlier that day, their colors bright against the dark sheen of her hair. I wore my cleanest shirt, the one Margaret had sewn before she passed. As the final words were spoken, the first cool drops of rain began to fall. A ripple of motion went through the crowd, men lifting their faces to the sky, as if in thanks. The rain grew quickly, drumming on the cabin roof, darkening the dust at our feet. The smell of it rose sharp and clean, mixing with the scent of wet horsehide and trampled grass. The warriors laughed and called to each other in the rain, some clapping me on the shoulder as they passed. Ironcloud stood near, speaking with his daughter one last time, before they would part for now. When he turned to me, his face held the same gravity it had from the first moment. "She is your wife now," he said, "but she will always be my daughter. Her safety and her well-being are in your care." I told him I understood, and he nodded once. Then he mounted his horse, the leather groaning under his weight, and looked out over the wide plain. "The drought has broken," he said. "Other things that seemed unchanging may yet change." One by one, the riders turned their horses and began to move off the line, stretching into the distance. The sound of their departure faded into the steady rain, leaving the yard empty, but for the two of us. We stood a moment longer in the downpour before stepping inside, water dripping from our clothes, the air in the cabin warm from the fire still burning in the hearth. Outside, the rain kept on soaking into the thirsty ground. Inside, Ayanna moved to the small table and set out 2 cups. "Are you content with what has happened today?" she asked, her voice quiet under the sound of the storm. I met her gaze, knowing the days ahead would bring their own trials, but also knowing she was no longer a stranger in my home. The firelight flickered over her face, and the steady fall of rain filled the spaces between words. I didn't answer right away, letting the moment stand. The wind shifted outside, rattling the shutters, and somewhere far off a single horse gave a sharp call through the dark. The rain lasted through the night, steady and unhurried, tapping against the roof until the smell of damp earth filled the cabin. By morning, the air had cooled and thin mists clung low over the prairie grass. Ayanna was already at the hearth, stirring a pot of cornmeal while I checked the yard. Puddles had gathered in the wagon ruts, and the thirsty ground had drunk deep. The garden, beaten flat by the downpour, still showed signs of life green where there had been none for weeks. That day passed in a quiet rhythm. We worked side by side, repairing a section of fence and gathering what vegetables had survived. Ayanna moved with purpose, her hands sure whether tying a knot or lifting a bucket from the well. Each small task carried the ease of someone accustomed to work that needed doing without delay. When the sun dipped low, we sat on the porch, letting the evening wind carry the scent of wet sage across the open ground. The following morning, I led the mare out to check the northern pasture. Ayanna walked with me, a woven basket hooked over her arm for gathering wild greens along the way. The land rolled gently in that direction, dotted with stands of cottonwood where small birds darted in and out. It felt different now, with the dust settled softer somehow, though the soil underfoot still held the hardness of drought. We spoke little on that walk, letting the quiet stretch between us. She paused at one point to kneel by a patch of plants sprouting near a seep, their leaves small but sturdy. "These will grow well now," she said, brushing the dirt gently from her fingers. I nodded, marking the spot in my mind for later tending. By the week's end, the prairie had begun to change. Streams that had been nothing more than cracked beds now carried trickles of water. The cattle from a neighbor's spread grazed closer to my boundary than usual, drawn by the new green. Ayanna watched them from the porch, her eyes following the slow, deliberate movement of the animals. "They sense the shift," she said. "It will bring others too." Her words proved true sooner than I expected. 2 days later, a wagon passed along the far ridge, its canvas top bright in the sunlight. The driver, a man I didn't recognize, slowed when he saw us, tipping his hat before continuing east. Ayanna's gaze lingered on the wagon until it vanished over the rise. "Word travels," she murmured. The routines we settled into were simple but steady. I split wood while she mended what clothes needed it, her stitching neat and strong. We shared meals at the small table, the space between us filled with the crackle of the fire or the soft clink of spoons. At night, the wind moved easily through the open windows, carrying the faint howl of coyotes from miles off. One afternoon, while I was stacking hay in the shed, Ayanna came to stand in the doorway. She had a handful of dried herbs wrapped in cloth. "For the nights when the air turns cold again," she said, passing them to me. The scent was sharp and clean, a reminder that her skills reached beyond the tasks of the day. The days lengthened, and with them came a shift I could not name outright, but felt in the way our steps matched when we walked in the unspoken rhythm of work done together. The land around us, too, seemed to hold itself differently, not in abundance yet, but in readiness. Late one evening, after the sun had dropped and the sky burned with the last of its colors, we sat outside watching the light fade. Ayana spoke of her father's camp, of the gatherings, where stories were told around the fire, and of her grandmother's voice, leading songs that rose into the night. Her words carried the cadence of memory, and the glow from the lantern beside us caught the curve of her smile. It was in that moment that I understood something had shifted in me as well. The solitude that once felt like a shield now seemed like an absence being slowly filled. The cabin, the porch, the stretch of prairie in every direction, all of it felt altered by her presence. The next morning broke calm, the air still cool from the night. I was at the barn checking the harness when I caught sight of movement along the southern rise. A single rider approached at an even pace, the horse's head bobbing with the rhythm of the gait. The sun was behind him, making it hard to read his shape, but as he drew nearer I saw he carried no visible weapon, only a small satchel slung across his chest. Ayana stepped out beside me, her brow furrowing as she shaded her eyes. The rider slowed, reining in a short distance from the yard. He raised a hand in greeting, but didn't dismount. "I've been sent with a message," he called, his voice carrying easily in the morning air. The rider guided his horse closer, the leather creaking as the animal shifted its weight. He was lean, no more than 30, with a weathered hat pulled low over his brow. Dust clung to his boots and the cuffs of his coat proof. He'd been on the trail for some time. Ayana stood beside me, her shoulders squared, her gaze steady on the man's face. "I've been sent from Chief Ironcloud," he said, his voice carrying over the still morning air. "My name's Caleb Morton." He reached into the satchel and withdrew a folded piece of hide tied with a thin strip of sinew. "It's for both of you." I stepped forward and took it, the weight of the leather warm from his saddlebag. The message inside was short, the words written in careful English. Ironcloud wished to meet with us at the edge of his camp in 3 days' time. There was no explanation beyond that, only a mark that served as his signature. Caleb waited while we read, his eyes moving from me to Ayana. "He wanted it hand-delivered," he added. "Said it was important you see him yourself." His tone held no urgency, but the fact that Ironcloud hadn't sent word through another relative or by passing trader told me enough. I asked Caleb if he'd take water and a meal before heading back. He nodded once, dismounted, and tied his horse to the post. Ayana set about fixing cornbread and beans, while I poured him a cup from the well bucket. He ate with the quiet manners of a man who'd spent most meals under open sky. When he was done, he thanked us, mounted again, and rode south, his figure shrinking against the expanse of grass until the ridge swallowed him from sight. That evening we spoke little of the message, but it stayed between us like a third presence in the room. I knew the journey to Ironcloud's camp would be safe enough under his invitation, yet I couldn't shake the thought that something more than a friendly visit awaited us. Ayana seemed to sense it too. Her movements were deliberate, her eyes thoughtful as she packed away dried meat and filled water skins in preparation. 2 days later, with the mare saddled and supplies tied down, we set off before sunrise. The prairie was damp with dew, the air holding a crispness that hadn't been there in months. Ayana rode beside me on a small bay gelding Caleb had left for her use. We spoke in low tones at times, but mostly we let the rhythm of the horses carry us. By midday, the land began to change. Clusters of trees thickened along a shallow creek, their leaves catching the light in shifting patterns. The ground there was softer, the air scented with the tang of wet soil. We camped that night near a stand of cottonwoods, the fire crackling low as the sky faded to deep indigo. The next afternoon we caught sight of movement ahead, riders in the distance, their forms distinct even through the heat shimmer. Ayana recognized them first. "Scouts," she said. They closed the space between us quickly, their ponies sure-footed over the uneven ground. The lead man, broad-shouldered and wearing a beaded band across his chest, greeted Ayana in their language before turning to me with a nod. "You come," he said in accented English, motioning toward the horizon. We followed without question, the scouts flanking us in loose formation until the land opened into a wide plain dotted with dozens of lodges. Smoke rose from several fires carrying the smell of roasting meat. Children darted between the shelters, and dogs trotted along the edges of the camp. Ironcloud was waiting near the center, standing tall beside a fire pit. He looked much as he had weeks earlier, his braids neat, his eyes sharp beneath the weight of years. When we dismounted, he stepped forward, clasping my hand in a firm grip before turning to embrace Ayana. We were led to a shaded space beside his lodge, where mats had been laid out and a pot of tea steamed over a small flame. Once seated, Ironcloud spoke without ceremony. "The alliance between our people and yours is fragile," he said. "There are those who would break it if given cause." His gaze moved between us, steady and unblinking. He told us of a small band of young warriors from another tribe who had been seen near settler land, their intentions unclear. Some in town had already spoken of trouble brewing, and it would take little for suspicion to turn into open conflict. "Your union has calmed many," he said, "but others look for reason to doubt it." Ayana listened intently, her hands folded in her lap. When she spoke, it was with the same calm certainty I had seen in her before. "We will stand where we must," she said. Ironcloud inclined his head as if her answer was expected. He asked that we remain alert, that word be sent quickly should we see strangers near our land. As the meeting drew to a close, he placed a small carved figure in my hand. A token, he said, recognized by those who rode under his authority. "Show this if you are questioned," he told me. "It will speak for you when I cannot." We stayed in the camp until evening, sharing a meal with his family and listening to the low hum of conversation around the fires. When it came time to leave, the scouts escorted us back to the edge of the plain, then watched as we rode north toward home. The sky was turning violet when our cabin came into view, the light catching on the wet boards of the porch from an earlier shower. Ayana slid down from her horse and looked out over the fields, her expression unreadable. Inside, I set the carved token on the table, its smooth edges catching the lantern glow. Before I could speak, a sound came from outside, the slow crunch of footsteps on damp ground. Ayana turned toward the door, and we both waited as the steps drew closer. The footsteps drew up just beyond the porch. I opened the door to find a man in a trail coat, its shoulders damp from a passing shower. He looked to be in his 40s, square-jawed, with eyes that moved quick, as though weighing every detail at once. He introduced himself as Sheriff Tom Barrett from Mill Creek, the nearest settlement south of us. Barrett removed his hat, nodding to Ayana in greeting before stepping inside. He asked if he might speak privately, but I motioned for her to stay. She was part of whatever this was. He didn't argue. "I've come on account of some trouble brewing." He began, his voice low but steady. "Couple of ranchers out our way claimed to have seen strangers near their stock, said they weren't from around here and weren't settlers either." I didn't need him to finish the thought. The air between us tightened and Ayana's eyes narrowed. Barrett shifted his weight, resting his hat against his knee. "I'm not here to accuse," he added, "but I need to know if you've seen anything unusual along your end of the prairie." I told him the truth. No unfamiliar riders, no sign of stock being driven off. His gaze stayed fixed on mine a moment longer, then he nodded. "That's good to hear. Folks are uneasy, though. The alliance your marriage represents, it's new. It won't take much for someone to stir the pot." Ayana spoke, then her voice measured. "If there are riders out there, they may not be seeking harm. but fear will make men act before they ask. Barrett met her eyes, and I saw a flicker of respect there. "You may be right, ma'am," he said. He left us with a request to send word by the first passing rider if we saw anything worth noting. As his horse's hoofbeats faded into the distance, the cabin felt quieter than before the weight of his visit, settling into the space he'd left behind. The next days were watchful ones. I worked the fields with half my attention on the horizon, scanning for movement that didn't belong. Ayanna spent more time near the garden and the edge of the property gathering plants, but always with her head lifting now and then listening. It was near dusk on the third day when I spotted them. 2 riders far off to the west, moving slow and keeping low in their saddles. The sun was behind them, so I couldn't make out their faces, but their ponies were lean and quick, not the sort settlers favored for hauling. They stayed just long enough to take in the lay of the land before turning north toward a line of cottonwoods. Ayanna joined me at the fence, following my gaze. "They're testing the edges," she said quietly. I knew she meant they were measuring the space between our homestead and the world beyond. We saddled our horses without another word. We trailed them at a distance, keeping downwind and using the rise of the land for cover. The tracks they left were light, but clear enough sharp hoof prints in the damp earth, weaving between patches of taller grass. We followed until twilight bled into the sky and the sound of running water reached us. At the creek's bend, we reined in. Across the water, the 2 riders were dismounted, speaking in low tones beside a small fire. Their ponies stood tethered nearby. Ayanna studied them for a moment, then shook her head. "Not from my father's people," she said. We stayed long enough to fix the direction they took when they broke camp north toward land claimed by neither settlers nor any single band. It was country that could hide a dozen men without a trace if they knew it well. By the time we returned home, the moon was high and the air had turned cool. I took the carved token from the shelf and set it on the table between us. "We send word to Ironcloud," I said. Ayanna agreed. She penned a brief message in her language, wrapped it in oilskin, and sealed it with a strip of cloth from one of her dresses. The following morning, I caught Caleb Morton passing by on his way back toward the southern camps. He agreed to deliver the note and took it with the care of someone who understood its weight. When he rode off the trail, dust hanging behind him, I knew it might be days before we heard anything back. In the meantime, the routine of the homestead went on wood to split a roof patch, to tend fence rails, to check after the last rain. Yet beneath each task ran the quiet thread of readiness, the sense that at any moment the land around us could change again. It was late in the week when the sound of hooves came up the eastern slope, this time fast and sure. Ayanna stepped onto the porch as the rider came into view alone. Bareheaded, his hair pulled back and his horse lathered from the run. He reined up, hard eyes scanning the yard before fixing on me. "I bring word from Ironcloud," he called out, his voice carrying over the wind. The rider swung down from his horse, the animal's sides heaving from the hard run. He was young, maybe 20, with a braid that brushed the middle of his back and a beaded strip tied at his shoulder. Without hesitation, he reached into the leather pouch slung across his chest and produced a folded square of barkcloth. "From Chief Ironcloud," he said, handing it to Ayanna. She opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the marks inside. The message was brief. Her father had received our warning and confirmed the strangers we'd seen were from outside his alliances. They had no claim to be in these parts, and they were testing boundaries that had been agreed upon. His instructions were clear: we were to hold our ground and expect a visit from a small party of his most trusted men. I asked the young messenger if he would take water before riding back. He accepted, drinking deep from the dipper, while his gaze swept the yard and fields. "They will come by tomorrow," he told me, setting the cup down. "You will know them." He mounted again, gave a nod, and was gone, the beat of his horse's hooves fading into the wind. The rest of that day, Ayanna and I worked in quiet preparation. She moved through the cabin, setting out what blankets and provisions might be needed for guests. I saw to the animals, checked the tack, and made sure the tools by the barn were stowed away. By sunset, the sky was streaked in gold and deepening blue, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth. The following afternoon, 4 riders appeared on the ridge to the east. They descended at an easy pace, their ponies stepping light, the men dressed plainly but carrying themselves with quiet authority. At their head rode a man I recognized from our last visit to Ironclad's camp, tall with silver in his hair and a calm steadiness in his eyes. They dismounted in the yard, and after greetings were exchanged, we moved inside to talk. Their leader, whom Ayanna called Thomas Greyhawk, explained they had tracked the strangers north after our sighting. "They're careful," he said, resting a hand on the table, "but they left sign. They know they're being watched." We discussed where the riders had been seen and the likely routes they could take to avoid open ground. Greyhawk spoke of watching not just the trails, but the water sources, for no rider could move far without them. Ayanna listened closely, offering what she knew of the land between here and the northern flats. As the light shifted in the windows, we agreed on a plan. Greyhawk's men would set themselves along the likely paths far enough to stay unseen, but close enough to send word quickly if the strangers approached. My role would be to guard the homestead and act as a point of contact for any message riders. They stayed until evening, sharing a simple meal before making camp on the rise above the creek. The sound of their voices carried faintly through the night, blending with the soft rush of water over stones. At first light, they rode out, each taking a different direction. Ayanna and I returned to our work, though our eyes strayed often to the horizon. That afternoon, while mending a section of fence, I caught sight of movement far to the west. Through the shimmer of heat, 3 figures on horseback were making their way along the edge of the low hills. I didn't follow, not then. Instead, I waited until they had passed from view, then saddled the mare and rode to find Greyhawk. I met one of his men along the creek, and he carried the news back toward the others. It was agreed we would hold position for now, watch and be ready. By the time I returned, Ayanna had water boiling on the stove and the door propped open to catch the evening breeze. She looked up as I stepped inside. "They'll come again," she said, not as a question, but as a fact. I nodded, the image of the riders still sharp in my mind. The sun dropped behind the ridge, throwing long shadows across the yard. Somewhere beyond those hills, men we didn't know were moving through country that had been quiet until now. The air felt still, as if the land itself was listening. The air was cool the next morning, the sky washed clean from a night breeze that had carried the scent of rain from somewhere far off. Ayanna and I were out by the corral when a lone rider crested the ridge. Even before he raised his hand in greeting, I knew it was Thomas Greyhawk. His approach was steady, the dust curling low around his horse's legs. He dismounted without a word at first, resting a palm on the saddle before meeting my eyes. "It's done," he said simply. The strangers had been tracked beyond the northern flats, their trail turning east into country, where neither settlers nor Ironclad's people traveled. "They won't be back," he added, his voice sure. Ayanna stepped forward, and Greyhawk told her her father sent his respect and his thanks. We stood there a while in the morning quiet, the corral rails casting long shadows across the ground. There was no celebration, just the kind of deep relief that settles in slowly. Greyhawk mounted again, tipping his head toward me. "Keep that token close," he said. "It still speaks for you." With that, he turned his horse toward the horizon, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the open land. Life slipped back into its old rhythm, though it felt different now. The well water tasted sweeter, the garden grew stronger, and the days were marked by the easy companionship Ayanna and I had found. We worked the fields together, shared meals at the small table, and in the evenings sat on the porch, watching the prairie change colors in the fading light. Once in a while, riders would pass at a distance, some settlers moving stock, some of Ironclad's people traveling between camps. They always tipped a hand, or offered a nod, a quiet acknowledgement that peace was still holding. In a country where small sparks could turn into wildfires, that was no small thing. It struck me how quickly a man's course can change out here. One summer's drought had left the land and my heart bone dry, and a single moment offering water to a stranger had shifted everything. That choice brought Ayana to my door, tied my life to hers, and built a bridge between two worlds that had too often stood apart. Now, as the sun sets and the shadows grow long across our land, I think about the ties worth keeping. The ones you choose not out of obligation, but because they make you better, steadier, more at home than you were before. Out here, fences mark where the land ends, but trust marks where the heart stays. If you've ever had a moment that changed your path, I'd like to hear it. Sometimes the smallest kindness can carry farther than we know.